Ancient Egypt. When you think of it, what comes to mind? Towering pyramids, golden sarcophagi, majestic pharaohs, and a civilization obsessed with the afterlife. We imagine a land of serene beauty, cosmic order, and profound wisdom. But what if I told you that beneath this shimmering veneer of harmony lay a justice system built on fear, pain, and superstition? A system where the line between law and terror was often blurred. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the brutal reality of justice in the land of the pharaohs. To understand Egyptian law, you have to understand their worldview. They believed in Mat, the cosmic principle of truth, balance, order, and justice. The pharaoh was Mat's earthly representative, and his laws were meant to maintain this divine harmony. On paper, it sounds beautiful. The reality, however, was far messier. There was no single, unified law. Code, like the code of. Instead, justice was a patchwork of royal decrees, local customs, and religious precedent. But what if human judges couldn't figure it out? What if the evidence was unclear? This is where the gods stepped in, quite literally. The Egyptians frequently used divine oracles to solve legal deadlocks. Imagine a procession carrying a statue of a god, like Omen-Ra, through the streets. The plaintiff and defendant would stand before the statue, and a priest would ask the god a yes or no question. For example, "Oh, my great lord, is it true that it was Panab who stole this tool?" Of course, it was the priests carrying the statue who made it move. This gave the religious establishment immense power. They could essentially decide anyone's fate. Was it a genuine belief in divine intervention, or a clever way for the powerful to maintain control? Probably a bit of both. It was a system ripe for corruption, or a few well-placed bribes to the priests could swing a verdict in your favor. The punishments were as harsh as the interrogations. For minor crimes, like petty theft, you might be sentenced to forced labor, public flogging, or have your property confiscated. But for more serious offenses, the penalties were terrifyingly creative. Grave robbing was considered one of the worst crimes imaginable, as it desecrated the sacred journey to the afterlife. If caught, you could face impalement, a slow and agonizing death. Adultery, especially for women, could be punished by having your nose cut off, not only disfiguring you but also marking you for life. For treason or rebellion against the pharaoh, the punishment was often death, followed by the complete erasure of your name from all records. This was the ultimate penalty, as they believed that to be forgotten was to cease to exist for eternity. There was no second chance in the afterlife. You were just gone. Let us look at a real-life case that shows just how chaotic this system could be. The infamous story of the tomb-robbing trials from the reign of Ramesses IX. This wasn't a one-off crime. It was a massive conspiracy involving dozens of people, including artisans, priests, and even high-ranking officials. A mayor from the West Bank of Thebes, Pacer, accused a rival mayor from the East Bank, Pora, of being complicit in the looting. A special commission was formed to investigate. They rounded up suspects and, you guessed it, examined them with the birch and the screw. Confessions were extracted under torture, revealing a vast network that had been systematically plundering the Valley of the Kings for years. One craftsman confessed, "We went to rob the tombs, and we found the burial place of King Sekim. We stripped off the gold, and we set fire to their coffins." The scale of the corruption was staggering. But here's the twist. The initial investigation, led by the accused Mayor Pora himself, found most of the suspects not guilty. It was a classic case of the fox guarding the henhouse. It was only after more pressure and further investigation that the true extent of the conspiracy came to light. Even then, many of the powerful figures involved seemed to have escaped serious punishment, while the lower-level thieves were likely executed. This case perfectly illustrates the dark side of Egyptian justice, the reliance on torture, the potential for corruption at the highest levels, and a system where your social status often mattered more than your guilt or innocence. It wasn't always about Mat and divine order. Sometimes it was just about power. So, the next time you see a documentary about the serene and mystical world of ancient Egypt, remember what lay beneath the surface, behind the golden masks and the hieroglyphs, telling tales of eternal life, was a legal system that relied on pain to find truth, on superstitious rituals to decide fates, and on brutal punishments to maintain order. It was a world where justice was not blind, but was often swayed by wealth, status, and the will of the priests who claimed to speak for the gods. The civilization that gave us wonders of architecture and art also had a justice system that could be just as terrifying as any monster from their underworld. Ever wonder how a civilization that built the pyramids handled crime and punishment? You might think they had massive stone tablets with laws etched into them, right? Well, the truth is way more fascinating. Ancient Egypt had no law books, not a single one that we've ever found. So, how did they maintain order for over 3,000 years? It all came down to a single, powerful concept. Mat wasn't just a goddess with a feather on her head. It was the very essence of balance, truth, and cosmic harmony. For the Egyptians, the entire universe operated on this principle of balance. When a crime was committed, it wasn't just a violation against a person. It was a disruption of Mat, a crack in the universal order. The goal of the legal system wasn't just to punish the wrongdoer, but to restore that cosmic balance. So, who made the rules? At the very top was the Pharaoh. He was seen as the earthly representative of the gods, and his decrees were law. His word was final. But the Pharaoh couldn't be everywhere at once. So, he delegated authority to a chief minister, the vizier, who was known as the priest of Mat. The vizier oversaw a whole network of local courts, called kenbets, which were usually made up of respected community elders and priests. When a dispute arose, say a farmer accusing his neighbor of stealing grain, they'd go before the kenbot. There were no lawyers. Each person represented themselves. They would present their case, bring witnesses, and swear oaths to the gods. Lying under oath was a huge deal because it was a direct offense against Mat and the gods themselves. The judges would then deliberate and make a decision based on tradition, precedent from similar cases, and the Pharaoh's decree. Their primary goal was always to find a solution that restored harmony to the community. Punishments could be pretty harsh. For minor offenses, like petty theft, you might be forced to pay back what you stole. Sometimes double or triple the amount, or you could be sentenced to a beating. The standard was often 100 strokes with a cane, which sounds brutal, but it was a common way to enforce order. For more serious crimes, the consequences were severe. Robbing a tomb was one of the worst crimes imaginable because it desecrated the sacred journey to the afterlife. The penalty was often death, sometimes by impalement or being burned alive. Adultery was also taken very seriously, especially for women, and could result in mutilation or even death by drowning. The whole system was built on a foundation of religious belief. The ultimate judgment, of course, came in the afterlife, with the weighing of the heart ceremony. The Egyptians believed that after death, their heart would be weighed on a scale against the feather of Mat. If the heart was heavy with sin and wrongdoing, it would be devoured by a terrifying monster named Ammit, and the soul would cease to exist. But if the heart was light and balanced, the person would be granted eternal life. This belief was a powerful deterrent. The fear of final judgment in the afterlife was a constant reminder to live a life in accordance with Mat. So, while they didn't have detailed legal codes written down like we do, the ancient Egyptians had a remarkably effective system. It was a blend of divine authority, community justice, and a deep-seated cultural belief in balance and order. It was this invisible framework of Mat that held their society together for millennia, proving that you don't always need a book of rules to build a lasting and powerful civilization. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this glimpse into the past, make sure to like and subscribe for more. What if I told you that in ancient Egypt, stealing a loaf of bread wasn't just a petty crime? It was an act that could unravel the very fabric of the universe. Sounds intense, right? Well, welcome to the world of ancient Egyptian law, where justice wasn't just about right and wrong, it was about maintaining cosmic balance. The entire Egyptian worldview revolved around a single, powerful concept. Mat wasn't just a goddess with an ostrich feather on her head. She was the embodiment of order, truth, harmony, and justice. Everything, from the rising of the sun to the flooding of the Nile, was part of Mat. And crime was a direct assault on this universal order. It was a chaotic force that threatened to throw everything into disarray. So, when it came to punishment, the goal wasn't just to make the criminal pay. It was to restore Mat and bring the world back into balance. Let's step into an ancient Egyptian courtroom, but forget what you see in movies. There were no bewigged judges or fancy gavels. Local courts, known as kenbat, were often held right out in the open, maybe in the town square or at the temple gates. For these, you'd be sent to a higher court, often presided over by the vizier, most powerful official in Egypt, second only to the pharaoh himself. The vizier was considered the high priest of Mat, so his role as chief justice was incredibly important. His court was the supreme court of the land, and his decisions were final. Well, almost final, because at the very top of this entire pyramid of justice sat the pharaoh. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was considered a living god on earth, the chosen intermediary between the gods and humanity. His word was literally law. He was the ultimate source of justice, the final court of appeal. If the gods spoke through the pharaoh, then who could argue with his judgment? His decree was absolute. A pardon from the pharaoh could save a man from the executioner, and a condemnation could seal his fate forever. This divine authority gave the system its ultimate power and legitimacy. Now, let's talk about the punishments. If the goal was to restore cosmic balance, you can bet the punishments were designed to be memorable. They ranged from the relatively mild to the downright brutal. For a minor theft, you might get away with a simple fine, or being forced to return the stolen goods. Sometimes with a hefty interest penalty, but for more significant crimes, things got physical. One of the most common punishments was the beating. The culprit would be taken to a public place and flogged with a wooden stick, a punishment known as the best. The number of blows was specified by the court, and it could range from a few taps to 100 or more. Surviving 100 blows was, as you can imagine, a severe and often crippling ordeal. The goal was public humiliation and deterrence. When your neighbors see you getting thrashed for stealing grain, you and they are less likely to do it again. For other crimes, the punishments got even more creative and cruel. Mutilation was a popular choice. A corrupt official might have his hand cut off. Someone who committed perjury lying under oath could have their nose and ears sliced off. This wasn't just about causing pain. It was about marking the person for life. A man with no nose was instantly recognizable as a liar, a social outcast forever branded by his crime. Forced labor was another option. Criminals could be sentenced to work in the scorching desert quarries or the mines, a fate that was often a death sentence in itself. The conditions were horrific, and few survived for long. This was a way of making the criminal pay back their debt to society through grueling, back-breaking work. And then there were the capital offenses crimes, so heinous they demanded the ultimate price. Treason against the pharaoh, major tomb robbing, or premeditated murder were often punished by death. But there were levels of severity. A clean execution might be a quick beheading. But for crimes that truly offended the gods, the punishment had to be more extreme. One of the most feared methods was impalement. The criminal was forced onto a sharpened stake, a slow and agonizing way to die, left on public display as a terrifying warning. Another was being burned alive. This was considered particularly horrific because the ancient Egyptians believed that, for a person to have an afterlife, their body had to be preserved. Burning the body to ash denied the criminal any chance of eternal life. It was the ultimate punishment, not just ending their life on earth, but erasing their existence from the cosmos entirely. This brings us to one of the most famous legal cases from ancient Egypt, the harem conspiracy against Pharaoh Ramesses III. In a plot worthy of a TV drama, one of the pharaoh's secondary wives, a woman named Tai, conspired with officials, guards, and sorcerers to assassinate the king and place her own son on the throne. The plot was discovered, and the conspirators were rounded up and put on trial. The surviving court documents, known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, give us a fascinating look at the proceedings. The pharaoh appointed a special commission of 12 judges to hear the case. The evidence was presented, and one by one, the plotters were found guilty. The punishments were severe. High-ranking officials who were part of the conspiracy were allowed to take their own lives, a slightly more honorable end. Others were executed. The sorcerers involved faced the fire, their bodies and souls obliterated. As for Queen Tai and her son, their fates are less clear in the records, but it's safe to assume they did not walk away free. The conspiracy trial shows the system in action at the highest level, dealing with a direct threat to the divine order and the stability of the entire kingdom. But what about the average person? If you were accused of a crime, How did you prove your innocence? Without modern forensics, it often came down to your word against someone else's. This is where those oaths became so important. But there was another, more dramatic method used when evidence was scarce: the divine ordeal. Imagine two people are arguing over who owns a cow. With no witnesses and no proof, they might go to the local temple and appeal directly to the god. This could involve a ritual where the statue of the god would somehow indicate the guilty party. Scribes recorded instances where a statue would nod or turn towards one person. How did this happen? It was likely the priests, hidden from view, manipulating the statue. But for the people, it was the god speaking directly. This might seem strange to us, but it was a way of finding a resolution when all other... Imagine walking through a bustling town square centuries ago. The air isn't filled with the sounds of merchants and children playing, but with a tense silence, broken only by the jeers of a crowd gathered around a central platform. This wasn't entertainment. This was a spectacle of power. Public punishments were a cornerstone of society, designed not just to penalize an individual, but to send a chilling message to everyone watching. From the stocks and pillories, where people were locked in place for hours, sometimes days, enduring public scorn and having rotten food thrown at them, to more severe forms of physical discipline. The message was brutally clear. These weren't private matters dealt with behind closed doors. They were public performances, meticulously staged to maximize humiliation and fear. The goal wasn't rehabilitation. The concept of correcting behavior through understanding and guidance was a distant future idea. The primary objective was control. Think about this psychological impact. Every time you walked past the town square, you'd see the remnants of these events as stocks, the gallows. It was a constant, looming reminder of what happens when you step out of line. This fear was woven into the very fabric of daily life. It created a society where obedience wasn't just a choice. It was a survival instinct. A community living in a state of controlled terror was far less likely to question authority, to dissent, or to rebel. These methods were incredibly effective for the rulers of the time. Why? Because fear is a powerful motivator. When the consequences of defiance are so visible and so visceral, most people will choose to conform. The sight of a neighbor being publicly shamed or physically punished was a far more potent deterrent than any law written in a book. It was a lesson taught not through words, but through experiences shared, collective trauma that kept the social order firmly in place. The humiliation wasn't a byproduct. It was a key feature. By stripping a person of their dignity in front of their peers, the system demonstrated its absolute power over the individual. Let's look at specific examples. The pillory, for instance, wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was about social death. Your friends, family, and neighbors saw you at your most vulnerable, helpless, and shamed. This mark of public disgrace could follow a person for the rest of their life, affecting their ability to work, marry, and simply exist within their community. This social pressure was an ingenious form of crowdsourced law enforcement. The authorities carried out the initial punishment, but the community, driven by fear and a desire to distance themselves from the accused, would continue the punishment long after. The transition away from these public spectacles was slow and happened for complex reasons. As ideas about human rights, dignity, and the purpose of justice began to evolve during the Enlightenment, people started questioning the morality and effectiveness of such brutal methods. They argued that punishment should be about correction, not just terror. This led to the rise of the modern prison system, where punishment was moved behind walls, out of public view. The focus shifted, at least in theory, from public humiliation to confinement and reform. But the legacy of public punishment lingers. It reminds us of a time when justice was a performance and fear was the main tool of governance. It raises important questions that we still grapple with today. What is the true purpose of punishment? Is it to deter others, to correct the individual, or simply to exact retribution? And how does a society maintain order without resorting to fear? Exploring this dark chapter of our history reveals so much about the human desire for control and the long, difficult journey toward a more human. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you broke the law in ancient Egypt? It wasn't just about paying a fine or spending a few nights in jail. For some crimes, the consequences were truly terrifying. The ancient Egyptians had a strong sense of justice, deeply intertwined with their religious beliefs and their reverence for the Pharaoh. While petty theft might get you a beating or forced labor, there were certain lines you just did not cross. These were the unforgivable crimes. Offenses so severe they were thought to disrupt the very fabric of their society and offend the gods themselves. Committing one of these acts meant you weren't just facing human justice. You were facing divine wrath. So, what were these ultimate transgressions? Let us journey back in time and uncover the 4 crimes that could earn you the most extreme punishments imaginable in the land of the pharaohs. First on our list is a crime that struck at the very heart of Egyptian society: stealing from temples. To us, it might just sound like theft, but to an ancient Egyptian, it was so much more. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were considered the literal homes of the gods on earth. These massive complexes were also the economic powerhouses of their time, holding vast quantities of grain, gold, precious oils, and fine linens. These weren't just treasures. They were offerings meant to sustain the gods and ensure their favor. The gods, in turn, were believed to maintain Mat, the cosmic order of truth, balance, and justice. So, when someone dared to steal from a temple, they weren't just taking property. They were directly disrespecting a god, stealing the deity's own food and possessions. This was seen as a direct attack on Mat itself. The act could anger the gods, potentially bring in famine, floods, or disease upon the entire community. It was an act of cosmic vandalism. The punishments had to match the severity of this spiritual crime. Getting caught could mean being impaled on a sharpened stake and left for public display as a gruesome warning. Others might be sentenced to be burned alive, a particularly horrifying fate for Egyptians who believed the body needed to be preserved for the afterlife. Stealing from a god meant you not only forfeited your life, but risked your eternal soul. Next, we have a crime that might seem strange to us today: killing a sacred animal. The ancient Egyptians had a deep reverence for the animal kingdom, believing many creatures were earthly manifestations of their gods. For example, cats were associated with the goddess Bastet, protector of the home and bringer of good fortune. The ibis bird was linked to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. And of course, the powerful crocodile was connected to Sobek, the god of the Niles, fertility, and military might. These weren't just mascots. They were living embodiments of divine power. To harm one of these sacred animals, especially intentionally, was a grave sin. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt, was shocked by this. He wrote that if someone killed a cat, even by accident, the penalty was death, no questions asked. The rage of the public was so intense that a Roman official who accidentally killed a cat was reportedly torn apart by an angry mob, despite pleas from the pharaoh himself. This wasn't just about animal cruelty. It was blasphemy. Killing a sacred animal was like striking down a living idol. The punishment was swift and brutal, often carried out by the community on the spot. It sent a clear message: the gods are walking among us in many forms, and to harm them is to invite disaster upon yourself. Our third unforgivable crime is one that threatened the pinnacle of Egyptian power: treason against the pharaoh. The pharaoh wasn't just a king or an emperor. He was a living god, the Horus on earth, the intermediary between the divine world and humanity. His well-being was directly linked to the stability and prosperity of the entire nation. He was the commander-in-chief, the high priest of every cult, and the ultimate judge. Therefore, any act against the pharaoh, whether it was a conspiracy to usurp the throne, an assassination attempt, or even speaking ill of him in a way that undermined his authority, was the ultimate act of treason. It was an attack on the gods and on the state of Egypt itself. One of the most famous examples is the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. A secondary wife, hoping to place her son on the throne, plotted with high-ranking officials to murder the king. Your tomb needed to be stocked with all the food, furniture, and magical spells you'd need for eternity. Tombs were sacred, eternal homes. Robbing a tomb wasn't just grave robbing. It was condemning a soul to eternal oblivion. You were destroying their chance at immortality. The punishments were horrific, often involving impalement or burning. Another grave religious crime was practicing forbidden magic. While magic, or Heka, was a part of everyday life, using it to curse someone, especially the pharaoh, was a capital offense. It was seen as using divine power for chaos and destruction. Desecrations, whether desecrating a tomb or weaving a dark spell, were considered attacks on the cosmic order. The punishment wasn't just about retribution in this life. It was about ensuring that the offender's spirit could cause no further harm, in this world or the next, from stealing from the gods' homes to harming their sacred creatures. From plotting against the divine Pharaoh to shattering the sacred peace of the dead, these 4 crimes were the ultimate taboos in ancient Egypt. The punishments were so extreme because the crimes themselves were seen as existential threats. They didn't just harm an individual. They risked plunging the entire cosmos into chaos, angering the gods, and disrupting the delicate balance of man. Justice in ancient Egypt was more than just law and order. It was a sacred duty to maintain harmony between the human and divine worlds. Crossing these lines meant facing a fate worse than death. Thanks for watching. And if you're fascinated by the ancient world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the past. See you next time.